Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University in Shanghai, where the四海为学collaborative learning project is based. I want to welcome you to the first event of the 2024-2025 academic year, and this is also the third consecutive year that we've been running 四海为学. Today we are hosting a book discussion of Professor David B. Wong's Moral Relativism and Pluralism, which was published by Cambridge University Press last year. We have a really nice lineup of scholars who specialize in fairly different areas here to discuss Professor Wong's book with him. We have Professor James Lenman, who teaches at Sheffield University, Professor Richard Kim, who teaches at Loyola University in Chicago, and Professor Christopher Gowans, who teaches at Fordham University in New York. Our chair this evening is the very capable Angelia Shen, who is currently studying at Beijing Normal University. It has become a tradition here at 四海为学to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs and sometimes discusses. And Angelia is definitely someone we expect to see in the future. So if there are any other young scholars in the audience who wish to be part of our events, please email me and we wholeheartedly welcome you. This book discussion will be about 2 hours total and end at 10 p.m. Beijing time. We will begin by having Professor Wong give us an overview of the book, and then invite each discussant to have a conversation with Professor Wong one by one. And then if there's time at the end, we open the floor for questions from the audience. Before getting started and handing things over to Angelia, I want to say a few things about the 四海为学Collaborative Learning Academic Forum. The 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices of contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and "look at me, I'm smarter than you," or "don't I know so much," and similar attitudes that we sometimes find in academic exchanges. The 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchanges by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people truly learn from and with one another. Before introducing our chair, I want to once again thank Professors David Wong, James Lenman, Richard Kim, and Christopher Gowans for joining us. Our chair is Angelia Shen, who is a master's student at Beijing Normal University. Her interests include classical Confucian and Taoist philosophy, the modernization of Confucian thought, and research on the history of Chinese philosophy by Anglophone and Taiwanese scholars. She is currently researching the concept of the self in the Analects and is preparing her PhD applications for next year. So when Angelia sent me her short bio, she ended it by saying, furthermore, she frequently attends 四海为学 as part of the audience, and having learned a great deal from this platform, she warmly recommends it to other graduate students. So thank you very much, Angelia, and I also do hope that more graduate students and even undergraduate students get involved. So we're very happy to have you here today. The floor is yours.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Angela Shen, and I feel quite honored to chair today's lecture. First of all, let me give an introduction of our lecturer, Professor David Wong. David Wong is an American philosopher and Susan Fox Beischer and George D. Beischer Professor of Philosophy at Duke University. He has contributed to ethics, moral psychology, comparative ethics, and Chinese philosophy. Wong is particularly noted for his defense of a version of moral relativism. His book include Moral Relativity, Nature Modalities, and the Chinese translation of metaphor and analogy in early Chinese thought. Today, we will discuss his latest book, Moral Relativism and Pluralism, which was published that year. Now, Professor Wang, the floor is yours.
Sure. Let me first say I'm very glad to be here at 四海为学. A number of our students have participated, and so I'm just glad to be now part of it. So I'll start by saying that at the beginning of my monograph is a conversation I had with my mother when I was a teenager. She said she didn't understand the American obsession with happiness. To her, the point of life was to fulfill one's responsibilities to others, the weightiest of which were responsibilities to family. She wasn't denying the importance of happiness, I think, but rather stressing that it had to be earned through fulfilling our responsibilities. Half of me accepted what she said. The other half wanted to be free to pursue happiness. Such ambivalence over which values should guide one's life, though not everyone feels it, suggests that our disagreements very often concern values we share. Their opposing pulls on people like me indicate that tensions between appealing values are difficult to resolve and perhaps do not admit of a uniquely correct resolution. This has led me over the years to write a series of articles and 3 books attempting to confirm that intuition. My argument over the course of 3 books and a series of articles hinged on a plea for reconceptualizing the menu of available positions to allow a kind of pluralism. The great bulk of existing literature, it seems to me, tends to polarize the menu of viable positions on relativism to the extremes. Either morality was entirely about objective moral truths, such that there was a single true morality, or it was a thoroughly subjective product of contingent and variable responses from the individual or society. My own sense is that there is much to learn from the philosophical motivations behind both extremes, and quite a bit of theoretical territory in between that can answer to these motivations. I stake out a form of pluralism which denies that there is a single true morality, but accepts the truth of a range of moralities that satisfy universal constraints. My strategy of argument is to start with the difficulty of resolving disagreement, focusing on the kinds of value disagreements that seem both difficult to resolve and concerned with what is most important to human beings. Most philosophers in the Anglophone Academy, when they focus on questions of substantive moral values, tend to discuss intramural disagreements in the modern Western tradition, and in particular, those involving utilitarian and deontological values, roughly the greater good of the greatest number versus, according to each person, the treatment they deserve. While I think value judgments or value conflicts involved in saving the greatest number of innocent lives at the expense of a lesser number of innocent lives are important and reveal some of what is most important to human beings, I have come over the years to increasingly strong conviction that they miss a lot of what is most important to most human beings, namely their connection to each other. The lived ethical sense of responsibility to and for others, the trust that engenders, is part of what makes that connection worthwhile. The degree of priority given to relationship is what distinguishes morality centered on relationship and community from morality centered on either utilitarian or deontological values. Under either of these kinds of values, the individual is taken as morally basic, whether it be the welfare or happiness or utility of the individual to be aggregated and maximized under utilitarianism, or some trait individuals possess, such as rationality or the possession of basic interests in virtue of which they have rights under deontology. In the latest book, I have focused on what sort of criticism might typically come from right-centered moral traditions of relationship and community-centered traditions. My own particular comparative knowledge is rooted in the ancient Chinese tradition, and in particular, the Confucian stream of thought, and so have mainly discussed particular responses to such criticism to be extracted from that stream. However, there are many other moral traditions in which relationship is given high priority, including the Ubuntu tradition based in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, indigenous traditions such as those of the Chippewa and Anishinaabe. The relationality that is highly valued under these traditions can include the organic interdependence of all life, including the human, plants, and animals, and land and water. There are streams of thought within contemporary Western moral philosophy, including feminist care ethics, that give a prominent place to an ethic of relationship and community. At the same time, there are significant differences between and within all these streams of moral thought. So I've only made claims about how Confucians might respond to criticisms from right-centered traditions. One of the newer lines of thought explored in this latest book is an argument from our epistemic responsibility to consider how people rooted in different moral traditions have thought about how to live, and to realize how little most people know about these others and their traditions. Moral relativists are often criticized for intellectual laziness, for not making the effort to get to the bottom of moral disagreements, and for simply throwing up their hands and saying, "Who's to say what's really right?" But such criticisms can be turned around on those who believe there is a single true morality, the universalist in my terminology, for failing to be open to what they can learn from others, and for being unwilling to challenge their own deepest assumptions. On both sides, the accusations may or may not be just. It depends on the effort that the particular person makes to understand. A different, more specific ethical and epistemic argument can be directed towards those rooted in Western moral traditions that at the same time have often been used to criticize, or to rationalize rather, the exploitation and oppression of others on the grounds that their moral traditions are savage, barbaric, and inferior. One need not have personally engaged in such rationalization to acknowledge that there is a debt owed in virtue of being the fortunate beneficiary of ill-gotten gains, multiplied many times by time and interest. Those who owe this debt include those who, by their looks and ancestral origin, such as me, who have both experienced the scorn of condescension and have indirectly benefited from acts it rationalizes. I want here just to give a sample of the dialogue from the book that might be motivated by an appropriate sense of epistemic humility and indebtedness to others. Those who subscribe to right-centered moralities often dismiss relationship-centered moralities on the basis of stereotypes. For example, that such moralities subordinate or absorb the individual into the group, where the group is characterized by strong and rigid social hierarchies. The recent social science has become more sophisticated and has offered alternatives to the stereotypes through conceptions of interdependent individuals whose good overlaps with the goods of others. Philosophers such as Hull and Ames and Rosemont, whom Professor D'Ambrosio mentioned earlier, who are interpreting the Confucian tradition, emphasize the idea that fulfilling the self is to realize it in relationships of mutual care and respect with others, not to lose the self in the group. Of course, the interests of different individuals can conflict with each other, and in that case, the ideal is to balance and reconcile the conflicting interests in the light of the interdependence of individuals and the groups they strive to realize. The discussions in the Confucian text Mengzi about Sage King Shun's problematic parents illustrate this more flexible and balanced approach to conflict. One discussion says Shun wanted to marry, but he knew his parents would refuse if he asked their permission. So he got married without telling them. Mengzi defends this decision by saying that for Shun to let his parents refuse permission would have caused bitterness within his relationship with them. The implication being that it was ultimately more filial for him to satisfy his desire to marry and maintain the emotional health of his relationship to his parents. Mengzi's reasoning here suggests the opposite of the self-denying son who would do anything his parents wish him to do. I do not wish to claim that these interpretations are indisputably what all Confucians in the past and present have meant in conceptualizing the right relationship between individuals and others and the group. It is rather that these interpretations have a strong basis in the text and the way this moral tradition has been given flesh and blood in the practice of its values. Members of this tradition engage with each other over how to properly interpret and revise it or reject parts of it if necessary, just as members of Western moral traditions engage with each other. If there is difference and conflict between the ideals of right-centered and relationship-centered moralities, we should include within our comparisons the versions that contend with each other in that tradition, and we ourselves may have to make more normative judgments as to which versions best represent the tradition's core values. We have to consider the debates over gender hierarchies within Confucianism and the arguments of some contemporary Confucians that such hierarchies are not a necessary feature of the core values of the tradition, and that a productive dialogue between, for example, feminism, the care ethic, and Confucianism should take place. This is a theme that Yuanying has explored in particular. The fact is that all moral traditions evolve over time, sometimes from origins that many of us now regard as unacceptable, origins such as slavery and racial oppression that continue to poison the present. If we want the opportunity of criticizing that legacy and of putting forward what we believe to be the correct interpretation of values, such as liberty and equality, we should accord the same opportunity to others in relation to their moral traditions. I maintain that inquiry into whether there is a single true morality involves interpretation and judgment of which articulations of different moral traditions are the most plausible in terms of its central values. If the job is done correctly, one will find familiar ideas, often in unfamiliar contexts, and differences intertwined with such similarities. The classical Confucian tradition, for example, de-emphasizes the value of personal autonomy, having a protected space within which to make choices about how to live one's life, because of its emphasis on relationship and responsibility to others. On the other hand, it emphasizes moral autonomy, acting on one's moral judgments, even if doing so displeases and contradicts the views of those in authority. The Confucian tradition also shows evolution in the interpretation of its central values. For example, the contemporary political Confucian theorist, Joseph Chan, has proposed that it's time to incorporate within contemporary Confucianism a recognition of the value of personal autonomy, not to the point of recognize it as an overriding right, but as a value that has weight in moral deliberation. These considerations and developments within traditions make evaluative comparison between Confucianism and right-centered traditions a more complex and nuanced endeavor, to the point that one might also see how ways of realizing each type of tradition might offer fulfilling lives, with each offering trade-offs, liabilities, and downsides, corresponding to the benefits and upsides of the other tradition. To the extent that one conducts such a comparison and finds plausible and formidable versions of each tradition, one might begin to doubt that one tradition should be declared the winner. One might arrive at what I've called moral ambivalence, in which one becomes significantly uncertain as to whether there is a singular path to correctly adjudicating the differences between moral traditions. It is not a part of my argument that everyone has this experience. The experience, when some have it, has epistemic weight in proportion to the understanding that underlies it, understanding of what is to be said for all reasonable sides. Again, this is why I think meta-ethics cannot be done separately from normative ethics in the way that is often so done in contemporary meta-ethics. I spent some time in this new book on more traditional meta-ethical arguments that rely on its being part of the concept of morality itself that is about objective facts. But the intuitions that underlie such arguments may be as much a product of how moral philosophers are socialized into the tradition as it is some feature of moral language generally. I point to empirical work that reveals considerable variability in lay people's, that is, non-professional philosophers' ideas as to how objective morality is. One striking result is that the degree of objectivity attributed to moral judgments may depend on the particular subject matter of the judgment. Some judgments, such as those concerning abortion, assisted death, and stem cell research, tend to be regarded by significant numbers of people, as less objective, as not bearing truth value, or there not being a correct answer as to whatever truth value they might possess. The more conventional type of conceptual analysis conducted in meta-ethics presupposes that concepts of morality are uniform and stable across universal populations. But this may be wrong for a very interesting reason. Thoughtful people, even as they learn and employ moral language, may continue to think about the nature of morality, and their observations about the difficulty of resolving certain moral disagreements may affect their thinking about what sort of thing morality could be. Perhaps the experience of moral ambivalence plays a role here. The next part of my argument is that moral ambivalence, to the extent it has epistemic weight, puts pressure on meta-ethical theories to explain it. At this point, I offer what I term a naturalistic approach. It is not an approach premised on the reduction of all facts to physical facts. It does make use of some of the best science we now have that bears on the question of why human beings have moralities in their lives. The core idea is that a morality is that part of human culture, the set of norms, practices, and judgments that is used to socialize and guide human beings toward productive forms of cooperation. We may have acquired through biological evolution and its interaction with the advent of culture an array of motivational propensities, such as concern for others and concern for self, that make cooperation and shape it. But a morality serves to also to form, guide, and shape such propensities through norms of interactions with others and through ideals of character and the good life. I should note that a good part of this core ideal is already in the Confucian philosopher Xunzi, though Xunzi is neither a relativist nor a pluralist. My argument is that given such a conception of the roles morality plays in human life, that it's reasonable to expect there may not be just one correct way of promoting and sustaining interpersonal cooperation and internal motivational coherence. At the same time, I argue it may also be reasonable to infer that there are constraints on the type of morality that could actually effectively foster cooperation. Along this line of reasoning, I infer that a norm of reciprocity, requiring people to return good for good, might be a necessary component of all true moralities on the grounds that it helps take pressure off concern for others, to motivate cooperation, especially when cooperating exacts some self-interested cost. Another constraint in my pluralistic theory stems from the hypothesis that morality came to be conceived as not just any way of promoting cooperation, but a way that people can come to accept without coercion or deception. Subordination and oppression of one group by another is unfortunately very characteristic of human life. But so are attempts to justify it through conceptions of the dominated group as inferior, say in rationality or self-control. Rejection of this justification takes the form of showing its falsity, or by revealing how insincere it is when dominators make profitable use of the capacities of the dominated. This kind of dialectic may have embedded within the concept of morality a requirement of subordination, being unacceptable if it requires coercion or deception. A third constraint on all moralities, given its role in human life, is that they must acknowledge the value of accommodation, which serves as a resource for resolution and mitigation of conflict when people differ over the correct manner in which they cooperate or competing ideals of character and the good life. If the correct form of cooperation is not something writ into the fabric of the universe, but contingent on human beings and their characteristic motivations and capacities, then such differences will inevitably occur in any society. Moralities must contain values that serve as resources, enabling human beings to continue to cooperate with each other in some ways at some times. Otherwise, we are in Hobbes's war of all against all. But the solution is not Leviathan, but having enough regard, respect, and concern for the other, even in the face of serious disagreement. Accommodation favors the maintenance of some forms of constructive engagement with disagreeing others, even as one continues to contend with them. It may also favor the types of action on those issues that don't threaten to sever all relationship, but leave open the possibility for cooperation on other matters. Some moralities more explicitly acknowledge the value of accommodation. That Confucianism should be one of them is not surprising, given its emphasis on the value of relationship and its characteristic way of dealing with conflicts of interest in terms of balancing and reconciling interests. However, even when acknowledgement of accommodation is not so explicit in morality, I think it ends up being acted upon across a wide range of moralities. Another part of my book attempts to clarify the sense in which morality is socially constructed. Here I distance my view from one often associated with relativism, which is that moralities are discrete and uniform and belong to identifiable groups. People within virtually any group will disagree with one another on important matters. This point does not justify going to the other extreme of holding that morality is purely a matter of what the individual subscribes to. Morality is a way to call others to account, and that project presupposes there's enough in common to make it possible for the recipient of moral criticism to answer. My position is to deny that morality is a singular possession, that is, of either the group or of the individual. We must have enough in common to make cooperation at least somewhat of a viable enterprise, but there is always considerable room that individuals have in interpreting what is morally expected of them. My analogy here is to natural languages, which have no clear and unqualified boundaries, encompassing dialects and idiolects as they usually do, and undergoing continuous change as the lives of their speakers evolve in response to changing conditions. As they change and how they relate to one another change, their languages change. A problem usually posed for views such as mine is how people come to think of how people could come to think they are disagreeing over the truth value of a position. How can this be so if there's more than one true morality? Basically, my answer is that people are very often assume that their conception of the proper way to cooperate and interact with others, or the proper character to strive to realize, is the one that others have. They assume there is something that we all have in common. And the assumption is an easy one to fall into precisely because we do agree with each other on some basic matters. My pluralist position predicts this. And so when there is disagreement, one can make the inference that the other, or maybe oneself, or maybe both of us, if one is being fair-minded, is making some kind of mistake or not being sincere. This assumption isn't sometimes correct because people can simply be wrong in reasoning from values or norms that they share. But the assumption is only sometimes correct. And it takes some sorting through on various matters we disagree about to come to a different conclusion. My book is an argument that sometimes we ought to come to that different conclusion, that what we mean by the correct way to cooperate can be different in important ways from what others mean. And so we can be talking past one another and hence both be speaking the truth and still be disagreeing pragmatically about how we are to behave towards one another. However, if what I have suggested earlier is correct, some of us can get to the conclusion that there is no single correct resolution of some serious moral disagreements. That's why people can conclude that on some important moral matters, there is less objectivity to be found, as there may be on other matters. That is why some recent empirical studies conclude that people can take different positions on metaethical positions and questions, such as whether there is a single true morality. The book concludes with sections on normative relativism, which usually springs from the view that if some metaethical view of there being no single true morality is true, then there ought to be implications for how we should behave toward one another, such as being tolerant of others with different moral views or leaving them alone. I agree with critics who argue there's no such normative conclusion following from the metaethical view alone. If one holds the liberal moral value of autonomy, however, then one might conclude that one should interfere with others in ways that cannot be rationally justified to them. While this view is coherent, it runs into the problem that any group is rarely uniform in the moral beliefs that its members hold. So not interfering with the group is not something that some of its members would agree is right. Some would want us to interfere. Furthermore, the value we place on others' autonomy is just one value we hold, and interfering may serve other values we hold, such as protecting innocent life. And so our choice is more complicated. In the book, I discuss such complexities with respect to the issue of female genital cutting, and in how certain cases one might justifiably act on the value of accommodation. The value of accommodation, which plays a role in my theory as one of the constraints on all viable moralities, plays a role in my discussion of abortion. In order for the contention over abortion to be something better than a war of laws passed by different states in the US and an occasion for the different sides to revile one another, which it now is, I think that broader social and political change needs to take place to give people the space to deal with the moral complexity of their own positions on abortion and on the complexity of the positions of others. People need to encounter others with substantially different views, but within an environment that encourages them to get a better sense of the full and complex humanity of others. This aim is generalized from what I am trying to achieve in this latest book, to promote a deeper exploration of what lies behind and belies the stereotypes we have of others. I discuss the desirability of institutionalizing occasions on which people from different backgrounds are brought together to deliberate over matters such as abortion or climate change or immigration. The results of such endeavors, such as James Fishkin's deliberative polling or the Irish Citizens Assembly, gives us some reason to be more optimistic about the human capacity for coming to understand and cope with what may seem initially unacceptable in others. In fact, I think that recent popular reactions against strict abortion bans and restrictions passed by some state legislatures shows that people are capable of more complex and sympathetic understandings of others' moral positions. People in so-called red states may have views of abortion that most people here at Duke, for example, would reject, but many of them have pretty complex positions on abortion, as some in-depth interviews of empirical studies have revealed. One of these studies reveals that even if one thinks it morally wrong to have an abortion, one can also hold that it is individual's right to make such a decision. Might this reveal some greater epistemic sophistication about the complexities of moral decision-making, and even some intellectual humility about judging what others should do when one does not know their circumstances and life experience? Is this even a rejection of the appeals of posturing politicians that make self-righteously things right again? I would hope so. So I'll end at that, and I'll be happy to hear the commentaries. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Wang. Next, we invited 3 commentators to share their opinions, and after each comment, Professor Wang will respond. Let me introduce the first commentator. The first commentator is Professor James Lenman, or we can call him Jimmy Lenman, who grew up in Dundee, Scotland, and was a student at Oxford and St. Andrews Universities. He is a professor of philosophy at the University of Sheffield. He has published many papers mainly on ethics. His book, The Possibility of Moral Community, is forthcoming from Oxford in September 2024. His book with Ben Rambo, Should We Maximize Utility? A debate about utilitarianism, is forthcoming from Routledge in February 2025. Now the floor is yours, Professor Lenman.
Thank you, Angela. Can you hear me? Good.
Yes,
and
of
thank
course.
you, Paul, for inviting me. I'm extremely interested in contemporary ethical theory. I'm also extremely interested in Chinese philosophy, and I'm extremely interested in the enterprise of putting these two things into conversation with each other. And it's impossible, as everyone here knows, to have that constellation of interests and not have learned a vast amount from the writings over many years of Professor Wong. So I'm very grateful and very honored to be invited to take part in this workshop. I've written my remarks out as a document, which I'll read to you, and I thought I would share it, if that's going to work, so that you can follow it as a text. I have a Scottish accent, which isn't always easy to follow if your native language isn't English. So can you now see the text of my talk?
I guess we cannot.
Oh, you can't. I was told I could share my screen. Is there something I need to do to make that happen? Or perhaps, Paul, I emailed you the text. Is it possible for you to?
Yeah. Let me just pull it up here 1 second. Okay, just 1 second here. All right, can everybody see?
That's fantastic. Great. Can you scroll down as we go on? Thank you so much. Okie dokie. So, Harmon, as David, now it's okay to call you David, Professor Wong, as David
Please do.
Notes, frames relativism as the question whether there's a single true morality. And when I ask myself if I agree with the claim that there's not, the answer is a kind of complicated yes and no answer. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. And I suspect that David is broadly going to agree with what I say, but maybe he won't quite, and maybe there's some qualifications. So it might help to get clear in my mind exactly what his position is. So consider ball games. Ball games are defined by their rules. If you consider football, I'm a British English speaker. By football, I mean what Americans call soccer and what Chinese people call zuchu, where two sides of 11 players try to kick a ball meeting certain physical specifications into opposing goals on opposite sides of a pitch, where pitch and goals are of certain specified sizes. Football, I say, is a good game. And there are many other good games. Tennis is a good game. Table tennis, ping pong is a good game. But in the space of all possible games, a vast space of possible games, most games are bad. Bad games tend not to have names because nobody plays them, but we can name them. We might call silly ball a game which is exactly like tennis, except instead of using a tennis ball, we use a table tennis ball. And then there is very silly ball. Very silly ball is exactly the same as tennis, except instead of using a tennis bat, we use a tennis ball, we use a football. These are not good games. I take it obviously. And by the way, I take it objectively. These are not good games. There are bad games and good games. Nobody thinks there's just one good game. The idea of a good game is, we may say, multiply realizable. What makes a game a good game? Well, there are not exact rules about that, perhaps, but there's a bunch of rough desiderata. My Chinese dictionary app thinks the word desiderata is so rare that it doesn't include it. So it means yao qiu, requirements. Rough desiderata we hope to meet. Most importantly, perhaps, we want games to be fun. Now, here's an observation. The rules of a given game, like football, are one thing. The desiderata by which we evaluate games are another thing. The desiderata are completely separate from the rules of any given game. They're not dependent on them. They're not expressive of them. They stand above the rules of the various games as external criteria for judging which games are the good ones. What we're doing when we think about whether football is a good game is a completely different activity from what we're doing when we're playing a game of football, or perhaps refereeing a game of football and seeking to apply its rules. Different societies have different moral practices. I say that with some care. I completely agree with everything David says about not thinking of these things as distinct, monolithic, and hermetically sealed. We all learn from Michelle Moody Adams' wonderful book from 20-odd years ago. That's just a grotesquely bad anthropology to think of things in that way. It's much more complicated. But for simplicity, I'll say different societies have different moral practices. For example, we solve certain coordination problems in different ways. You drive on the right, we drive on the left. That's a matter of great moral consequence once the decision's made. For me to endanger my fellow citizens by driving on the wrong side of the road, which would be the right where I live, would be gravely morally wrong. But the choice is not so important. my French friends are not making a mistake when the French decide to drive on the right. We also, very importantly, have locally different rules of good manners, courtesy, the behavioral forms that we use to convey mutual respect, what Confucians call li. We shake hands. Japanese people bow. And neither we nor our Japanese friends are wrong. And Li, as any Confucian scholar will happily and correctly explain, are a matter of great moral consequence. We also encounter a kind of moral indeterminacy in balancing competing considerations. So, for example, different societies have different policies about at exactly what age they set the minimum age of lawful sexual consent. And we're torn between values. On the one hand, we feel protective towards possibly vulnerable young people. On the other hand, we feel we need to recognize that they are becoming adults and give them a level of autonomy and responsibility for their own conduct appropriate to that status. I suspect we'll agree readily enough that, for example, 12 is too young and 21 is too old. But there's a range of different answers that might be favored by reasonable people. I was actually thinking during David's remarks, by the way, that in some ways the debate about abortion is like that. Sometimes it's not. I think especially in North America, it's presented as a hugely polarized debate between a bunch of people who on the one hand think that taking a morning after pill when you're 1 day pregnant is just murder, and another group of people who think abortion should be freely available on demand at any point in the pregnancy. But most people, I think, hold neither of those views. And at least in British legal discussion, the conversation is really about at what point in the pregnancy we should start to restrict the right to abortion. Should it be 21 weeks or 22 weeks or 23 weeks? And it's a very similar debate to the debate about the age of consent. It's where to put a threshold rather than a polarizing debate between absolutes. I digress. There are many moral ways of life and many forms of moral practice. Some of them we think seriously defective, but others, when we try to understand them with sympathy and humility, we may think merely different from our own. We shake hands, you bow. And there are a bunch of yaoqiu, desiderata, that we use to evaluate and compare moral ways of life. David stresses, as he's reiterated just now, three important such desiderata. Acceptability. We want the rules of a moral way of life to be justifiable to those it applies to. Reciprocity, a norm of returning good for good. And finally, a norm of accommodation, a willingness to sustain relationships with others with whom we stand in normative disagreement. I think these are excellent desiderata. But notice something about them. They are not something that stands outside of and is independent of our own moral understanding. Rather, they are an expression of it. When we evaluate the rules of football, we're not playing football or applying those rules. But when we evaluate our own or someone else's moral outlook, we do so from a standpoint deep inside our moral outlook. There is no external standpoint from which such judgments can be made. I am at one with David's eagerness that we should explore the moral ways of life of other cultures with sympathy and humility. And I'm also at one, I think, with the thought that when we do so, we may find that there is more than one good way of designing a moral way of life. If that is what Harman's maxim means, then I think it may be true. But in doing so, I don't think we depart from, that we may enlarge the moral sensibility by which we live our ordinary life at home. We do not say, as we say with sport, that the rules of the game are one thing and the desiderata by which we evaluate them are something else. So while there may be multiple morally permissible moral ways of life, I think it is a bit misleading to say there's more than one single true morality. Instead, I think if by a single true morality we mean not a particular way of life, but a particular conception of what are good, right and wrong ways for human beings to live. Here, I think we do end up, or should aspire to end up, with a single true morality. But a single true morality that is inclusive, disjunctive, and respectful of moral difference. And in saying that, I'm really just repeating something Simon Blackburn says in a famous discussion of relativism in his 1984 book, Spreading the Word, to wit that travel broadens the mind. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Lenman. Now let's invite Professor Wong to respond.
Well, I want to thank Professor Lenman or James or Jimmy, if I may. And I find your Scottish accent perfectly intelligible. So clearly we do agree about a lot, and so I can only express my appreciation for that. It seems that so here's what how I'm thinking when I say there's more than one single true morality. The truth conditions for moral judgments that a given person may have, I think would have to include, under my theory, those universal constraints, but they don't only include those. To use your analogy, Jimmy, they include the rules of the game. If you're playing basketball, your truth conditions would include what it means to foul and what you you're entitled to do when you are fouled. They correspond to specifying a way of life that is part of shaping a way for people to cooperate with each other. And even though the boundaries between these different ways of life can get very fuzzy and can interact with others who live somewhat different ways of life, there are certain limits as to how you could possibly incorporate within what I call a single morality these differences. So the truth conditions for moral judgments, in my view, include these more specific ways of specifying what, in my language, would be called a form of cooperation. And from this other point of view, from which one draws back and takes this view of the origin of morality as based in the attempt of human beings to cooperate with each other and to form some kind of coherent intrapersonal motivational system. Taking that step back view, one can look and see that well, actually, there might be different ways of cooperating that, from the standpoint of universal constraints, look equally good. But for people to actually begin to shape motivations in specific directions, there are more specific criteria for how one should live and cooperate with each other. And so that's the standpoint from which I want to recognize that there is more than one true morality. A true morality being a more specific way, a subset of all those that satisfy the universal constraints of organizing cooperation, of forming a more coherent kind of character that makes sense of the somewhat chaotic set of motivations we all begin life with. So I think that's how I would explain where we might differ. It's in my having a more specific conception of how truth conditions emerge from the way people think and talk and act with each other. There's an inevitable degree of locality about that that characterizes truth. So maybe that's all I'll say at this point, and I'm not sure whether there will be the opportunity to interact, but I'll leave it up to the chair.
Sure. Do you have any response, Professor Lenman?
Can't hear
We
you,
cannot
Jim.
hear you.
Unmute.
I'm thank you, David. That was very enlightening and helpful, and I'm clearer now about your view. I'm happy to say more, but I'm not sure. Angela, do we have plenty of time, or is are we?
Perhaps you can save your response right now, and after the three commentators state their opinions, if there is more time, you can have further discussion.
Thanks,
Great.
Jimmy.
Because I think I should give chances for the other commentators to state their opinion. Okay,
Great.
so we really appreciate Professor Wong's thoughtful response. And now we move on to the second commentator, Professor Richard Kim from Loyola University, Chicago. Professor Kim's main areas of interest are ethics, moral psychology, East Asia philosophy, and comparative philosophy. His research focuses on deepening our understanding of well-being, along with related concepts such as emotion, virtue, and friendship. In both his research and teaching, Professor Kim employs an interdisciplinary cross-cultural approach, integrating traditional philosophical analysis with contemporary psychological research and insights from Eastern Asian philosophical traditions. Professor Kim also co-hosts the popular This Is the Way podcast on Chinese philosophy. Now the floor is yours, Professor Kim.
Okay. All right. Well, so let me begin by saying or thanking Paul for inviting me to this workshop, and also to Professor Wong for writing such a clear and crisp book. It was really a pleasure to read, and offered this very sophisticated and humane account of moral relativism that I think is actually quite timely and very appealing in the kind of global pluralistic world that we actually live in now. I should also quickly note I've long admired Professor Wong's works on classical Chinese philosophy, and for example, his rich exploration of practical reason in Mencius and Xunzi, And so I should say that. And so it's a real pleasure to be here. I could just spend all my time praising Professor Wong's book, but since this is a philosophy workshop, I should try to raise some kind of possible objection. Although I don't know if what I'm going to raise are really objections, but I think maybe issues that I would like to get a little bit clear on, especially from the kind of naturalistic, meta-ethical, relativist framework. Also, these are certain puzzles I just have generally, like people raise these kinds of questions to me all the time. So I want to have a chance to see what Professor Wong would say about them, because I find some of these questions to be very difficult. Especially because I am quite attracted to some form of ethical naturalism, although I tend toward more of a kind of Aristotelian account, combined with certain kind of Confucian sensibilities, perhaps. Okay, so so the central kind of question I want to raise has to do with certain kinds of moral intuitions and judgments, and whether or not we can get the right kind of explanation and grounding for those judgments from a kind of a naturalistic, relativistic framework. So the kinds of cases I have is some of this is discussed by Professor Wong himself. So for example, slavery. Another one would be like murder. Maybe another one would be valuing properly those with severe disabilities, living on the margins in some sense. And there's a thought here that I've come across in the work of people like Raymond Gaeta, where there's a kind of intrinsic value to human life, maybe a kind of almost a kind of reverence-worthy sacredness. And I was wondering how that might kind of because that's a concept that's not really quite discussed in the book, and I was wondering how maybe space could be made for something like that within this account that Professor Wong offers. Okay, so for example, slavery. So Professor Wong does address the wrongness of slavery in the book, and so here, let me just quickly quote. This is like page 29. So he says, well, slavery involves threats of harm, coercion, and deception, and so goes against the type of normative guide morality is supposed to be, which is a guide that can be accepted on a voluntary basis by appeal to interest, not necessarily or not only self-interest that human beings typically or characteristically have. This is plausibly one of the meanings of morality. I guess I did want to get a little bit of clarification because, yeah, so the thought seems to be that slavery is wrong. I mean, well, in a way, what's interesting here is that it seems like slavery is just not permitted at all because of the very meaning of the term morality or the very concept that morality involves. But I guess and so I might be misunderstanding, but I guess from my perspective, slavery is definitely wrong, and because it's unjust, it violates the worth and dignity of the person. Enslavement is a direct affront to the victim, a way of treating them that doesn't recognize their worth and dignity as a human. Now, of course, that will involve coercion and deception, but it does seem to me like we can make judgments about its wrongness within an ethical, like inside of morality or from within morality. And it's not so much as that it's just not even it's like kind of a non-starter based on the concept. So, but maybe that's just perfectly coheres with Professor Wong's view. So that was just kind of a clarificatory question. But it is connected in a way to this question I have about certain kinds of other moral judgments like murder. So murder is wrong, again, because something like it violates the worth of human beings, or it doesn't seem to respect intrinsic value of human life. And I did wonder if the way that it seems like the book might justify it would offer the right kind of justification. So there's like kind of these very naturalistic appeals to evolved dispositions of human cooperation and so on. But the wrongness of murder seems to be independent of those kinds of instrumental justifications or considerations of like social harmony. It seems like it's just straight wrong. It's a direct harm to the victim, and so yeah, it seems like something like that could be raised about other kinds of practices we have, like not desecrating a corpse. It seems like we have this kind of basic judgment from within an ethical worldview that is wrong, and the wrongness doesn't seem to depend on kind of further kinds of appeals to social cooperation. So, and this is connected to maybe one last thought here about that you do find in this philosopher named Raymond Gaeta I just mentioned. So Gaeta in his book mentions how when he was a young man, I think it was like 17 or so, he worked at the psychiatric ward, and how most people, including himself, thought of the patients as lacking characteristic human worth because they had severe mental illness, severe physical and intellectual disabilities. And a natural thought that comes to a lot of people, I think, and maybe slightly disturbing thought is, what are these people good for? But one day he encounters this Catholic nun who comes and then treats the patient in this powerful, loving way, like they truly mattered, was worthy of respect, despite the fact that they can't really contribute to society in any material way. But we do seem to think that nun's actions was quite admirable, noble, maybe even realizing the highest form of morality. And so there's these kinds of very heroic kind of deeds that seem to not really fit well within a kind of framework where we're thinking of morality as fostering social cooperation exactly, or maybe getting good in return for good. Sometimes these kinds of certain people they have really not much they can give back. I mean, I guess we can still find meaning in this kind of heroic work, but and I myself have seen people like this working with severely disabled people who have been kind of abandoned and left on the side. And to me, like these kinds of things reveal kind of, and maybe this is too religious of a language, but like a sacredness to human life, and this kind of idea that from a deeply ethical point of view, we have to be able to realize this kind of worth and value of human beings. And so, and I'm not saying that can't be fully accounted for within a naturalistic ethical framework, although, yeah, as someone who's very sympathetic, I do find these kinds of cases a bit more challenging, but they also seem very powerful and important also, at least from my own perspective. So, so yeah, I would just love to hear what Professor Wong thinks about these kinds of cases, and maybe just help clarify the matter. So I'll let him speak. Thank you very much.
Okay, Professor, please give us your response. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for Professor Kim, Richard. These are very thoughtful questions you raise. I think actually it relates somewhat to my answer to Jimmy. These universal criteria are derived from this naturalistic standpoint that it takes a step back from being let me say, immersion within a particular morality. And it's partly my desire to dissociate from a kind of reductionist naturalism, to allow for my desire to accept a certain kind of irreducibility of the normativity of moral judgment. The normativity can't be directly translated into instrumental satisfaction of the goals of social cooperation. To some extent, I want to try to incorporate that from within a naturalistic standpoint by talking about how it has perhaps become incorporated into the concept of morality, that subordination that can't be justified except through coercion and deception is unacceptable. And that's the closest I I get utilizing this naturalistic standpoint to the kinds of intuitions that Professor Kim is pointing to. The intuition that slavery violates something very fundamental to the value of human existence, or that murder similarly is something that the wrongness of murder has to do with a kind of basic violation of the person. So I do think that there is a certain kind of these are part of in my view, the kind of local criteria that goes into the truth conditions within a particular morality. The strength of how we feel about it may influence us to think that's got to be something universal, that everyone's got to have somehow be able to know. But that, to me, is more it has to do with the particularity of being enculturated within a particular moral tradition. I kind of want to acknowledge at the same time that it may go against just the strength of conviction that we might bring to the judgment of the wrongness of slavery or certain kinds of egregious murder. I think there's a tension there that I don't think damages the argument, but it's something that as a human being we might feel uncomfortable with. And I think that's maybe something that we have to live with if we take this kind of position that involves a kind of duality of from the standpoint of having achieved whatever kind of character we have in at this point in life, and bringing strong convictions to it, and at the same time, as I say, stepping back and asking, well, what from a more naturalistic standpoint how can we explain how we are here, and have the kinds of normative perspectives that we apply to ourselves. So I guess I have to say these are very good questions, but yes, they can be answered. I can answer them, I think, but at the same time, I want to acknowledge the sense of lingering discomfort with the lack of full endorsement that a naturalistic standpoint provides of what in my view is a kind of internal perspective, moral perspective, that if moral socialization is successful, we will feel with some degree of intensity. But I think, on the other hand, what we gain from this is some greater openness to what other human beings have thought and lived by.
Okay, thank you, Professor Wang. Now we will succeed to the third discussion. This time, our commentator is Professor Christopher Gowans. He is a professor of philosophy at Fordham University in New York City. He works in moral philosophy with interest in the implications of moral diversity and moral conflicts, including moral relativism as well as Asian philosophical traditions in various cultures. In his early career, he edited moral diplomas and wrote analysis logs and examination of inexplicable moral wrongdoing. In more recent years, he has written Philosophy of Buddha, Buddhism, Moral Philosophy, and Introduction, Self-Cultivation Philosophies in Ancient India, Greece, and China, and numerous papers on Buddhist philosophy. Now the floor is yours, Professor Christopher Gowans.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. So I would like to thank Paul D'Ambrosio and the Collaborative Learning Project for organizing this event and inviting me to participate. I'd like to thank David Wong for writing this book, and really beyond that, for writing your earlier book, Natural Moralities. All of David's work is impressive and worth reading, and so I'm always happy to have a chance to talk about it. And thank you also to my fellow commentators for their discussions. I have some somewhat similar, but I think some different points that I'd like to bring up. So let me first say that my comments all follow from the fact that I think the basic claim of the book, Meta-Ethical Moral Relativism, is correct. I think David has here and earlier developed a powerful defense of this view. I think the strategy of trying to explain moral diversity and disagreement by reference to what he calls the functions and constraints on any true morality is the right approach to these topics. I also liked his emphasis on epistemic humility, and in particular the fact that he exhibited that, I thought, throughout the book. That was very impressive. And his views about accommodation, I think, are also important, though I guess I did have one question about that. So what I have to say is more in the category of like friendly amendments and requests for clarification or suggestions of things that might be elaborated upon. I wrote down a lot of things, probably don't have time to talk about all of them. So on the first point, I know I raised this earlier, David, what are we trying to explain here? On page 3, early on, you say what's being explained is similarities and differences in morality, the role morality plays in people's lives, and laypersons' attitudes towards moral objectivity. So I think that's exactly the right way to put it. But you emphasize to a considerable extent, and did so again here today, what you call the feeling of ambivalence that some people, but not all people, have. So I think I'm one of the people who has that, and make that quite central to what you're trying to explain. But you also refer to psychological studies. So you highlight the Goodwin and Darley paper, but there is, as you know, now an extensive body of literature about, something like ordinary people's sort of meta-ethical views about objectivity, relativism, and the like. And I think what that shows is that there's just a lot of diversity in what people think. And so some people do have definite kind of relativist or non-objectivist intuitions, but lots of people have objectivist intuitions too. And there's variation that has to do with, the issues that are raised, as you point out. So seems to me that that's the main thing that is important to explain is both the more relativist intuitions. So ambivalence is an instance of that, but also the fact that people have objectivist intuitions. Some people have both, and what I like about your theory is that you address, as it were, both sides. There's no single true morality. There's plurality of true moralities addressing the non-objectivist ones. But there are these real constraints, and that makes a difference, and that kind of addresses the objectivist side. So what I think is that explaining, giving a good account of that literature as a whole is what gives your theory real power, and the emphasis you place on ambivalence, from my point of view, is so that's a part of it, but it's only one part. So that's my first point. A second point is, so as I see it, you identify sort of two functions. One is social cooperation, and the other is internal motivational coherence regarding ideas of the good and worthwhile life. But then you go on and list three constraints. One of them is justifiability to those who are governed by the moral outlook, which I take it you think is connected to the cooperation point. I wasn't completely clear on that relationship. But then the other two have been mentioned here today are reciprocation of good for good and accommodation. So one question I had is, like, how do all of these work together to render a verdict as to whether a particular morality is true or not? So, I mean, you've got several different considerations. That's a part of your pluralism is that. So does a true morality have to sort of meet each standard or meet some minimal condition for each of those? Are some more important than others? It does seem like there is a kind of primacy given to social cooperation. Could a true morality be sort of weak in one respect, but much stronger in others? So I did have a general question about how we take all of those, which seem to me to be plausible ideas. And, if we're really wondering, is if this going to be one of the true moralities, how do we get a verdict about that? So now on like each of those particular points, these are rather different sort of issues. So on cooperation, I think some people might argue that like more could be said about what that implies. So I think some people might think that any society where you have social cooperation, that people are going to have some virtues, like virtue of justice or trustworthiness, something like that. And maybe some deontic requirements, prohibitions. So this maybe relates to Richard's point on killing, on lying, stealing. I mean, all those things could be understood in a kind of broad way where we recognize they can be interpreted and developed in different ways. But I could see ways the position could be developed where it has a little bit more content along those lines. So I wondered what you thought about that. And similarly, on the point about the coherence constraint, the second one, I mean, that's a formal constraint that there be coherence. But again, I think it might be argued that any conception of a good life, for example, would involve some form of courage and temperance. Again, broadly construed, that it might be given more substance beyond a formal constraint. So that was a question I had. Now, justifiability. So let me just, you talk about marriage practices at various points. So the idea is that, a true morality has to be something people could voluntarily accept based on human interests. So here's an argument. People have a human interest in marrying the person they love. And so from that point of view, someone might say practices such as arranged marriage that preclude that, or prohibitions on same-sex marriage, are a violation of that, and hence could not be willingly accepted. So that would be an example of this that might have some substantial impact, but I'm not sure that you want to say that. So I wondered, how you would respond to that. And it seems like I know you say it's not a social contract about the origin of morality, but it does seem that you're kind of in the territory that's analogous to what Rawls was up to, that it's kind of hypothetical consent. We're thinking about what people could freely agree to given human interests. And so it seemed to me you were kind of in that territory, but I wasn't quite sure if that was right. I'll skip reciprocation. I was going to say the same thing that I wrote in my review earlier of your book. So I won't repeat that. On accommodation, so I liked what you said in the latter part of the book. But what you give is, and you're very clear on this. So you give a view that you say, well, if you accept some kind of notion of Kantian autonomy, and we combine that with the meta-ethical relativism, we get an argument and then about tolerance, and you explore the complications. So I know you've made that kind of argument before, or at least part of it, and so I'm on board with that. But what I was wondering is what accommodation might mean in a morality where Kantian autonomy is not part of it. So I see that argument, but you're granting that there are going to be true moralities that don't have that. And I did wonder some about what would accommodation mean in those cases. And I'm trying to find another page here. So in your examples at the end, where you're defending this view, so you talk about, so this is related but slightly different point. You talk about seeking compromise and consensus. You use those terms, but that's your initial definition of accommodation is to try to understand those we disagree with. Okay, so that seems right, but seeking compromise and consensus, I think, goes beyond that initial definition. I think sometimes people can have a kind of respectful disagreement, as we have this expression in English, to agree to disagree. I think even like within a marriage, people might do that. They don't see any basis for compromise or consensus. They just see they're different. But I think that could be a form of accommodation. So I wondered what you thought about that. Let me just say one other thing. I had a number of comments, so I don't want to go on too long. So I probably already said too many things. On section 12, where you talk about the groups, on the social construction of morality, is it the group, is it the individual? And you say there's an alternative position to saying it's the group or the individual. And in that section, you say all sorts of sensible things about the complexity of groups, the way groups interact, diversity within groups. So I think all of that is right, but I'm still not quite sure what your alternative is. What does that amount to? I mean, I think a central phenomenon. I mean, moralities are often sort of identified in different ways in terms of nationality, or ethnicity, or religion, or social class. Nowadays, of course, we talk a lot about race and gender, and people. So understood in those ways, people can be members of and identify with different groups, and the different groups conceivably might have different moralities. So I wonder if you could say a little more about what the alternative is. I mean, maybe the right thing to say is we should just recognize all these complexities in talking about any particular question and do the best we can. But as I say, I wonder if you could say a bit more about that point. So I probably have spoken long enough and raised enough questions. So I'll leave it at that. Okay, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Christopher Gowans. Let's proceed with Professor Wong's response.
Yes, thank you, Chris. It's good to see you again. I have to say that Chris's earlier comments on my work, in particular the Natural Moralities book, played a major role in stimulating my further thinking about some of these issues, and so I'm grateful for that. Let me get to the notes I took on your comments. Yeah, so what are we trying to explain? You began with that question, and as you know, I tried to take into account a variety of different views that ordinary people have about morality and its objectivity. Some are more relativist, some are more objectivist. And as I said in the presentation, a striking variation is that the degree of objectivity attributed to morality may depend on the specific subject matter on which a position is being taken. So I felt it important to not ignore that, or to simply take a parochial set of philosophers' intuitions about what morality is about, but to take this variety seriously. And one desiderata I derived from that is that your theory has to make it possible to explain this variety. If your theory ends up attributing some uniform view of objectivity to people, then I think that's the wrong result. It doesn't explain what's there in front of us. And so one thing I'm trying to do in conceiving of, again, this is going back to perhaps how we think of the truth conditions of moral judgments. We have, to some degree, some set of truth conditions that we assign to moral judgments that we have obtained by being raised within a certain, what I call a tradition, but there's a great deal of diversity within that tradition. We may nevertheless, because, as I was saying in the presentation, because we think of morality as something that, in terms of which we can call each other to account. Morality is not just a matter of having certain commitments of your own and expressing them or acting on them on one's own. Morality is part of this conversation we have with others. It's a way of, as I say, holding each other responsible, calling them to account, or calling oneself to account, but in the presence of others. So there are sort of powerful characteristics of morality that put pressure on us to learn from others, to share with them ways of holding ourselves and others to account. And that I do think that has to do with the fundamentalness of cooperation to human life. But at the same time, because this is something that that human beings are in a way creating continuously at the same time that they pass on established ways of cooperating, but also modifying it and changing it, and having different ideas about different forms of cooperation. There's all this diversity there at the same time. So what we have is a great deal of complexity here that can strike different people in different ways. Sometimes what stands out to some people is what we have in common, the possibility of holding each other to account. And because there are certain things that have to be common or shared, even across different kinds of moralities, we can focus on that. And we can come to assume, well, in the end, we're all talking about the same kind of thing. And this is where I think objectivist intuitions come from, right? But at the same time, you can also have a different focus. What strikes some people is the disagreement and the difficulty of resolving it. So it becomes possible to take a different metaethical position. This is why one thing that's emerging from the literature is, in fact, there's what might be true of the folk, as we like to say, is metaethical pluralism. People take different metaethical views. But all that, I think, is not surprising if you credit people with not only sort of being socialized into a moral outlook and learning how to be competent moral language users, but also thinking about it while they're using it, and maybe reflecting on what kind of thing morality is. So that's another sense in which I think that metaethics and normative ethics are sort of not really separate enterprises. So that's why I do place a great deal of emphasis on not only explaining this phenomena of moral life, but explaining its diversity. And what I claim as a virtue for my theory is that it becomes clear why there can be this kind of diversity, not only in moral views, but in metaethical views and what people might conclude about moral objectivity. It's not to say that I don't have a view about how much objectivity there is, but my view also explains how people could argue about it and have differences over it. Whereas, for example, some other metaethical views make it harder to explain. If morality is simply plainly about some objective fabric of the world, then I think it makes it harder to explain this diversity of intuitions. Or on the other side, if morality is something set up to simply allow groups to express their ways of organizing life within the groups, or if morality is something that's simply the expression of an individual's commitments, and we all sort of know this, it's hard to explain intuitions of objectivity. But on my view, that neither construal is correct. Now, you were asking about is morality, to further clarification on whether morality is of the group or of the individual, which relates just what I was saying. And I guess I do want to say something along the lines of what you suggested, that there's something more complex going on here, that first of all, we're not members of any one group. We're members of many different groups. And in fact, our moral views can be influenced by all of these groups. And that's why there inevitably are individual differences, not because morality is a matter of simply announcing our individual subjective commitments, but because we're all located in a complex social matrix of intersecting groups, and we're influenced by all of them. And as individuals, we show our location in that social matrix. We show both the influence of groups, of different groups we belong to, but also our individual ways of absorbing that influence. And the influence can go the other way, that, the stance we take can ripple out, can have some degree of influence on at least some of the groups we belong to. So there's this kind of interaction between group and individual that I want to point to as being a part of what I mean by denying that's either solely a matter of the group belonging to the group, or either solely a matter of individual commitments. There may be some greater clarity I could achieve there, but at present I'm not yet capable of it. About virtues. You note that I have these fairly general universal constraints. Is it possible to have other constraints or more specific ones? For example, whether there might be certain virtues required for cooperation. I do want to allow for that. I mean, I don't claim for these constraints to be exhaustive or comprehensive. They're the ones that I'm sort of the most secure in claiming. And if I don't mention that we need to have some virtues, such as courage, I'm less certain about the argument for these being necessary for the main aims of morality as I conceive of it, right? Necessary for achieving cooperation in some viable sense, or for motivational coherence. I can certainly see that within a fairly wide range of ways of life, that something we call courage could indeed be necessary, but I'm less secure about asserting that it's somehow universally necessary. And this is, by the way, how I conceive of the constraints as sort of necessary conditions, each of them posing necessary conditions for the two functions of morality that I attribute to it. Okay, so that a bit about the constraints. And you were pressing on the the justifiability to the governed, as I sometimes call it, that constraint that shouldn't take only on the basis of coercion or deception. Is this some kind of contract theory or somehow rolls in? I hesitate to say, I don't really want to say that some kind of consent is a necessary condition, which is oftentimes the way that the reason that I put in terms of if it depends on coercion or deception. And I think that I put it that way because I want to allow for the fact that acceptance of a way of life it's not as simple a matter as a fully formed, socialized, grown-up being presented with a set of moral norms and saying, is this okay with you? And that's partly because how we come to accept a set of norms it depends on how we develop, and those norms are partly themselves influential on how we develop. What I don't like about social contract theory that's taken pretty much literally is it sort of assumes a sort of pre-given individual. But at the same time, I do want to say there has to be some kind of constraint on how we can justify a set of norms, especially if they're a set of norms that subordinate. What I came upon was the more these negative conditions that you can't do it that way. But I'm less sure about how to put it in terms of a positive set of conditions. I'm pretty sure I don't want to put it in any kind of explicit social contract theory. Okay. On accommodation, I want to say I mostly agree with your comments, Chris, that seeking compromise and consensus is just one form of accommodation that one might implement. Simply, and you gave the example of a marriage in which people sort of agree not to go there when it comes to certain matters, and I think that's right, and I think that's one reason why at one point I put accommodation in terms of preserving the ground for constructive cooperation on other matters. So you sort of, maybe it's not really possible to go there on the hottest points of disagreement. Nevertheless, you want to preserve the possibility for constructive relationship for the time being, at least independently of those divisive matters. There are other means of accommodation that approach the source of division. But I think that oftentimes those two strategies are not unrelated. Sometimes you lay the best ground for coming to meet the other halfway when you have other ways of relating to the other. And those other ways of relating to the other may involve cooperation on other matters. It's really hard to reach accommodation and consensus if all you have to work with is the source of division. And that's why sometimes I stress the need to relate to others as the sort of complex, many-faceted beings they are. Now, the more dimensions there are to connect with others, the more possibility there is for positive connection that, as it were, can suffuse to the potentially divisive areas. So I'm not sure that I've covered everything, but thanks for those points, Chris.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Wong and Professor Christopher Gowans. And since we have some spare time, we want to open the chances to our audiences to put forth some questions. If you have any questions, please open your videos and state it directly. And for Professor Lenman, we are quite sorry for you because time is so limited. We want to facilitate conversations with other people. If you can continue your discussions later on. So either anyone want to put forth a question? If it is not so convenient for you to open your video, you can type it in our chat box.
Michael, you can just go ahead.
Can I just talk? Okay. My question is, and I know the workman just emailed me, he's on his way, but my question is about moral autonomy. In other words, I think if you're immersed, there he is. I'll have to write you the question, but the question is this. I don't believe we're autonomous. And I think that follows from what you're saying. I'll leave right now. Hey, how are you? I'm doing just fine. A little bit of a list. I was just in a Zoom meeting. Want me to leave the Zoom meeting? Sure. Okay. To be continued. Great.
Oh, okay. Maybe it turned off sooner than she intended. Anyway, I hope that Michael views the video of this later on, because I first of all wanted to thank her for the ways in which I've benefited from her work, and there are times when I've read something of hers on Chinese thought, and I said, "Wow, that's really something I should take up because it's right." So first of all, I want to thank that. On autonomy, moral autonomy, I certainly don't want to assert that there is autonomy in the sense that denies the fact that we are formed in so many ways by others, and that even the character traits we attribute to ourselves have an inevitable degree of locality to it. And by that I mean that how we respond to people greatly depends on who specifically we are responding to. That I behave differently in different contexts and towards different people. And this is part of who we are. Whatever global traits we have are only global to a certain extent, that there's a great deal of contextuality and situationality in who we are and what traits we possess. And in this very fundamental sense, who we are depends on who we are with, as well as how we've been formed. So that's the sense in which certainly I want to agree with Michael that there is no autonomy if it's meant in that very strong and absolute sense that we have these global traits that exist independently of who we're with. But at the same time, I think there are significant senses of autonomy that are worth acknowledging and perhaps even striving to realize. Moral autonomy is something that I say is there in Confucianism, and by that I mean it's the ability to make up one's mind in a way that resists external social pressures and the influence of certain incentives, such as others' rewards and approval, and to stand by how one has made up one's mind, despite the threat of being penalized for what one says or how one acts. I think that kind of moral autonomy, as I call it, is very strongly espoused within Confucianism, and Confucius, for example, points in the Analects, is quite chastising and severe with some of his students when he thinks that they have bent too far to pleasing their superiors and stooped to rationalizing their decisions in ways they know are not right. And so that's the kind of moral autonomy I want to say is present in Confucianism, even though other forms of autonomy, as I said in the presentation, are not there in classical Confucianism, this kind of personal autonomy. Though I also want to recognize that perhaps more contemporary versions of Confucianism can bend further in that direction. That, as Chan says, we're not anymore in societies where, the choices we have are to do what our fathers did. Yeah, I just want to clarify that response to Michael.
Okay, thank you, Professor David Wong. I guess we're running out of time. And Professor Danvers, is there anything you want to add before we finish the meeting?
No, thank you very much, everyone. I think this was a fantastic session and definitely a great way to start the academic year. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. It was great to have met you.
Yeah. Nice to meet you. And for everyone in the audience, if you're interested in watching any of this again, it will be up on our YouTube account. And if you go to our website, sahaiweisha.org, you'll also find a list under the calendar of all our other events. We have another event coming up Monday. And I'm going to throw in a plug for Richard Kim's podcast because I think that's also pretty good. So it's called This is the Way, and you can see it on warpweftonway.com. So, but again, thank you, everyone. This was a really excellent session, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Chris, Jenny, and Richard, especially.
Thank you.